The slides. Did I send it to both of you or just to me? Right, so it's me back. Otherwise, I could talk all that. The guy I think it might be worth. I think vaccination no, it's kind of complicated. Could you just turn off the lights and
Just had to sort out the microphone there because it has now been adjusted to be a little bit taller than me. Sorry that we have a slight delay there, but we are all ready to go now, and I am absolutely delighted to introduce you to Professor Lee Elliot-Major. I first heard him talk at the Southwest Disadvantage Network, which was an online event, and I was hugely impressed by the work that he was talking about and the way it chimed so much with my experience of being a teacher in the classroom. Not just, somebody talking that doesn't know what's going on, and just coming up with ideas. It just felt so real to me, and it felt so useful to me. And so when I contacted Lee and asked him if he was to come along and speak at this conference with the theme of Geography Makes a Difference, I was absolutely delighted when he said that he was able to come along. He's the first Professor of Social Mobility, I believe, and is based between London and Exeter, and so it's wonderful that he's come all the way up here to sunny Sheffield to join us. So thank you very much, Lee, for joining us today.
I was thinking, can I do a talk without any slides? Could do actually, but maybe we'll do that next time. I've got too many slides here, but I can share these afterwards, Catherine. So you're right, I am the country's first Professor of Social Mobility. When anyone says I'm leading thinker in this field, my 21-year-old, which just 21, says that's because you're the only professor in this field. But it is very much personal as well as a professional passion. My life, and I'm going to tell you a bit about my life as an introduction, is really dedicated, as many of you will be in this room, to trying to improve the life prospects of children, whatever background they may come from, and whatever they go on to choose to do. We'll come back to that, because there's a lot of things I want to challenge us around in terms of the assumptions we make about how we define success and how we define disadvantage, actually, as well. And it's great to be in Sheffield. I'm only going to be here for an hour and a half. I was here for 6 years. I did my PhD here in theoretical physics, which I don't mention in parts, because the competition goes dead as soon as you mention it. But I'm also a band of professors. I was saying to Catherine, and I think I offered to play, but you also had a better band here. It's the least cool band in the world. It's 4 physics professors. I'm 4. But we play the university ball every year. Although we're not playing this year, sadly. Anyway, so glad to be lovely to be back in Sheffield. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking a bit about my life story, and then cover some of the social class divide challenges that we face in this country and elsewhere. Some of the context we face as educators. It's really important that educators learn about the context in which they work. All the studies that have been done in education show that a lot of the variation in outcomes for children is shaped by outside school factors. It's something politicians don't like to talk about much. It's not an excuse, right, for us, but it is really important context. I want to show you some of the challenging challenges that we face as a society, which really impacts all of us as educators, right, in universities, in schools. I'm going to explain, and Catherine, you've probably heard this on that talk I did, about what I call the equity approach, okay? And this is a very much grassroots movement. I'm very proud of this. I give talks across the country and other countries to groups of teachers, and there's a thing called the equity scorecard we produced, and it's all about challenging ourselves as educators around biases, barriers that we often inadvertently and unconsciously create in our own classrooms and schools. So while I'm really challenging the assumption that many governments and politicians make about schools, which is basically let's allow inequalities to widen and basically not got to sort it out, that's basically the assumption a lot of people do. I push back a lot on that, but at the same time, I think we can up our game as educators, teachers. As I said, because I think we fall into a lot of what I would call deficit traps. I'm going to explain some of these terms. And the reason that I kind of developed this equity approach is a lifetime spent thinking about disadvantage and inequality and inequities, and a real frustration. I've been around a long time. If you look at the, I don't like talking about tech gaps, I think it's a really negative way of thinking about it. If you do look at those gaps in terms of things like, GCSE grades, grade 4, for example, you'll all be aware that you see these very constant divides over the years. And I've been involved in lots of things over the years, creating that famous co-created, I should say, that famous EF toolkit. Does anyone remember the EF toolkit? You still use that as the sort of best bets toolkit for the Education Down Foundation. I was one of the authors of that all those years ago. If you'd said to me 15 years ago, the TEDx would be arguably bigger now, I think I would have been very depressed by that. So one of the reasons that I've been exploring some of these assumptions we make is because I'm wondering why the system doesn't achieve more than it maybe should do. Putting into context that inequalities have widened as well. So at the end of the talk, I'm going to list some of the best bets that I have gathered from both practitioners, from mainly from the UK, but from other countries, but also some of the research evidence-informed equity best bets. I'm going to cover a load of stuff here. It's not going to be about geography, by the way. One of my hopes with this talk is that maybe we can think about how we might separate equity lens to geography specifically. I've done some lovely work with maths teachers, English teachers, so this work is starting to get into the disciplines. But today it's going to be quite a big picture. So I'm going to talk a bit about the principles of equity, the language we use. I don't use that term disadvantaged pupil. I think we immediately fall into a deficit trap if we use those sorts of terms. We implicitly blame that pupil for a disadvantage when it should be the children from a disadvantaged background. It sounds very rickety, very simple change in our language. But if we don't put that thing after the child, we implicitly blame them for their disadvantage in my view, and that leads to stereotyping. We'll come back to that. Language equity is really important. I thought about curriculum equity, pedagogy equity, and partnerships equity. These are sort of really about the practice of teaching and just trying to challenge ourselves about are we doing enough to level the playing field, if you like, in our classrooms and schools. I've got about 50 slides. I am going to get past this one slide. But yeah, I'll go through quite a lot today, and I guess it's a taste for you. We can share the slides afterwards. I'd love to talk to you afterwards when we get more time. So my story is something that I've used a lot in my lectures for training teachers, for undergraduates, public lectures I do increasingly. And it actually grounds me, I have to say, in some of the lectures I give. It grounds me in style of talk, but it's something that I've learned really opens up some of these discussions because my story really reveals some of the tensions in these debates, right? Some of the traps we fall into. When I do teach now, you know, this looks like it is from a different millennium, these images of me. Is there anyone old enough in this room to remember Curiosity Killed the Cat? Yeah, there are. Everyone says I look like that guy who used to wear a hat. I had a hat for him, by the way. The French TV looked me up and found out that I was this first professor of social literacy in the world, actually. And they all said I was a punk. It was really interesting. I wasn't, I was a post-punk. These are really important things to do all in my era. I was definitely not old enough to be a punk. But I had these sort of interesting haircuts. And I always, I got 2 children, 23 and 21 now. And I'm always ribbing them about that we were a bit more exotic in the 80s, early 80s. I use these images, it's a bit of fun, but there is a kind of story around my life that I tell. I left home at 15. I was the first in my family to go to higher education, so I eventually went back. It was a teacher, actually, that took me under her wing, got me back into school. My mum had to get up. I'm from Belton, which is in the shadows of Heathrow Airport. It was quite, term to use here, but it was quite a challenging area in the late 70s. And place, and as geographers, you will really understand this. When I show you some of what we're finding out about the class system in this country, place is becoming even more important now than when it was for my generation. So where you live, not just who you're born to, has a profound impact increasingly on your life prospects. And I travel around the country, we are hugely inequitable in terms of place in this country, and it's becoming more extreme. So I come from a place where there was not many people going on to higher education. Remember, higher education is one outcome, it's not for everyone, increasingly actually. We get to some debate about that. The principle that governs my work is background. You shouldn't tend to do whatever it is you choose to do. We'll come back to that. University is not necessarily for everyone. So I have this sort of background story, but I use this Daily Mail story to explain this. I was Daily Mail, I don't know if it's a very disconcerting experience. You get home one day and they say, we're going to do a story for you the next day. You're like, oh my God, what they've found out about me. I've had quite a life, you know, and I said, oh, but they found out that I was a bin man when I was younger. I think it was in another art somewhere. By the way, what they didn't tell the reader was that I was doing that PhD in theoretical physics when I was doing it. It was nepotism. My mum worked for the local council. It was a summer job, right? Anyway. When did facts get in the way of a Daily Mail story? But it was actually quite a positive story. It was some campaigning times during COVID, and they were really experts to back their campaign. It all happens to campaign, actually. It was to give laptops to children in their homes during the pandemic. But it was a classic story of social mobility. This sort of lad from a working class background becomes a professor, right? And I'm very proud of my journey. And you know, some of you will know I was chief executive of the Sun Trust charity as well before I became a professor. And an OBE as well. You know, all these things makes me very proud of what I've done. But, and this is the big but, these stories belittle people who are in there. And, you know, I was really proud to be a bin man, and I still talk to bin men to this day, actually. Who's this weird guy coming to us? People cleaning the streets, I always go up to them and chat to them. And the point I'm sort of making here is, again, is this point about a deficit. We tend to judge people doing incredibly valuable local jobs, not just bin men, but teachers, social workers, people that should be valued by society. In the latest book I'm doing, Cracking the Class Code, we sort of try and decompose some of the class divide, and a lot of it is around the values we have of people doing different jobs. And there are some amazing people who, you know, create wealth and create companies and all that stuff, but we don't pay people enough who do valuable jobs for society. No politician wants to sort of face these big issues that we have in our society. So there will be children in your classrooms who will go on to do incredibly valuable jobs near where you teach, right? And we should champion that, we should celebrate that. What I find with this stuff, with equity and deficit, is that everyone says, yeah, it's kind of obvious what you're saying, but when I visit schools, when I go to trusts, what I find is that we all fall into deficit traps. When I do some occasional talks for award ceremonies at schools, I find that we tend to celebrate most people like me who are quite academic, who do quite well. You can measure that. They're going to a university, they're doing well grades. Sometimes it's sport as well, but often we don't value those children who are doing other wonderful things. We don't bring people into schools often who are doing great, valuable jobs. We tend to get these sort of inspirational speakers that are left to achieve somewhere else. So while I hope most of the educators can kind of agree with some of the values that I espouse, I think because you're all so busy, and the system and the way we're measuring the system, this is about colleges, universities, and schools, makes us very transactional, actually. And we measure ourselves inevitably in almost very narrow measures that we're all aware of. When actually, my view is that as educators, we need to value these broader things that children go on to do. The university thing, by the way, has become more and more interesting to me because, of course, background shouldn't determine who goes to university, whatever university that is. Because, as I said, most of my family go to higher education, but universities are becoming very expensive now in terms of the loans. And it's not clear increasingly that the graduate jobs are as certainty as they were for my generation. We'll come back to that because some of the generational trends are really interesting in this space. So anyway, I'm going to get off this first slide, oh my God, because we will run out of time. So I use this metaphor of the level playing field. There's a TEDx talk I did a few years back. And it's just this metaphor I use a lot. One, to say that we do live in a very unequal world. But also, I talk a lot about cultural aspects of the barriers to learning. So I would argue that the barriers to learning are as much about cultural barriers as economic material ones. There is extreme poverty in this country. About a third, I think, secondary schools now have a food bank near them. It's a real sign of where we are as a society. But the rules, what I call the rules of the game, the way children come into school, whether they're inculcated with that cultural competence that we adhere to. It's a very middle class culture, if you're not inculcated, trained in those attributes, the evidence would suggest that as educators, we tend to judge you, not meaningfully, intentionally, as having less, I'll show you some quite challenging research around this, that we will tend to challenge those children who are not like us as having less capability. Without even us knowing, we are all prone to these biases. So culture is as important as the sort of material divides that we face as a society. I've done lots of books on all this. Emily, lovely sociology teacher, I did a book with a few years ago, and I've been talking about it ever since. Emily is going to do a PhD, she's had babies, other things have got in there. And cracking class code coming out later this year. If you're interested in social class, that book will be hopefully very interesting to you, in which we're looking at the global evolution of class. I'm going to give you a little taste of that as well. So this, again, I do a whole lecture on this one slide, by the way. I'm going to just give you a taste. I'll do all the things I say students don't do. I've got two of these slides here. But I just wanted to give you a little taste of some of these societal trends that we face, and then I'll come on to what we as educators can do about it. So professors of sociability, why we call that? What we tend to do is look at the origins of people, and then we look at their outcomes as adults, right? And the closer the link between your origins and the outcomes, the less mobility there is in society. So social mobility is about class. It's about doing geography. It's not about physical mobility, although it's connected to place. It's about social class and where we move in terms of class. You've got to be careful, as I said, there's some of the assumptions around social mobility. It's used by politicians in quite a narrow sense, you know, that you've got to kind of move on and succeed. It's really a measure of equality of opportunity in life. Again, remember that principle, background shouldn't tell you to do whatever it is you choose to do, right? This is not about judging success as getting rich or moving a class, but the degree to which people change their origins is a measure in society of equality of opportunity. What we find in the generational trends, so I look at 100-year trends, you know, increasingly politicians are sort of, I don't know why I'm around my politicians, I don't know where this is all coming from, but tend to be, as you all know, very narrow, very short term in their perspectives. I would argue, if you're really serious about understanding society, you've got to look at the longer term, much geological sort of timescale trends. This is 100 years sort of measure of one measure of social mobility. It's looking at what we call absolute social mobility. What this basically means is, did you, in absolute terms, do better or worse than your parents? You can measure this in terms of earnings, you can measure it in terms of access to housing. This is actually looking at social class, occupational-based social class measures. And most of them have a similar trend, and this is that in the post-war years, even though many of us, there is a very small class system at the top, nonetheless, many of us like me were doing slightly better or a lot better than their parents did. So you see this in housing. You know, I managed to get a flat in London when I was younger. That would be impossible now. I would have gone back to that. But compared to, so I was born in 1968, I'm part of the 1970 generation here, and basically the blue line there is the proportion of people experiencing upward social mobility, so doing slightly better than or a lot better than their parents. This was the same for each generation, so even though there were these divides, we still had this sense of progress, we were doing better. That all changed in 1980. Sorry to press you on this bright, lovely evening in Sheffield, but the red line is the levels of downward mobility. And there's lots of reasons why we think, and this is people born in 1980 onwards, right? So if it crosses over, it's probably going to go up for those born in later builds. This is always historical because what we do is we measure people at age 27, age 37, so you're always looking in the rear mirror of these studies. But the worry is that there are a lot more of us now who are doing less well than our parents were at a similar age. I think one of the classic measures of this is access to housing, actually. And in places like London, you really see it. Teachers are really struggling now in a way that they wouldn't have been a couple of generations ago. And teachers' wage is impossible now to get a place. But it's also impacting on the families of children we serve. And I think there's some quite profound things happening in regards to education. So the life model for my generation was, if you came from my sort of background, was work hard, come back into education, get a degree, get a job, get a flat, have a family. Not for everyone, but that's what a lot of us followed. The problem is now, for so many young people, there is no prospect of getting that place. And I think the whole model is unraveling. So you're seeing a lot of people questioning whether kids go to university, whether our children should go to school. It's really interesting. I think there's some quite profound sort of assumptions being checked. Whether it's conscious or not, I don't know. But certainly, I would argue some of the attendance crisis that we are facing is driven by these deeper societal trends. But that's all unraveling, if you like, the promise of capitalism that you can do well if you go to school, work hard, etc. The reasons for this are there's many debates about it, but part is just because we've become a more unequal society, particularly as it comes to wealth. Wealth is extremely. We are now getting to the point where we were 100 years ago, just before the global great crash. So no one's probably going to come soon, mark my words on that. But this is just levels of poverty. This is using the slightly crude indicator of free school bills for England, primary and secondary schools. You'll see that we just have lots more children who come from poor backgrounds that are defined in these terms. I get really frustrated with the government because every year in recent years they've said we've got more children from free school meals going to university. It's basically because there are more children on free school meals in the population, right? So that's a bizarre sort of thing. You need to look at the proportion of free school meals going into university. You need to be careful of your measures, right? They press release this every summer. Every summer I sort of respond to it. It's ignored. Anyway. This question I couldn't resist because I want to talk to you really about that point, that principle, that background shouldn't want to do whatever it is that children go to do, but we have problems of in British society. The audience is too big here to answer this question. But any idea how many universities have produced English prime ministers since the war? Anyone? 5, 3. This is a bit of a trick question, as you can imagine. Gordon Brown's Scottish, went to Edinburgh, so I'm not counting the market for this question. I'm going to still go with one here. It's a bit of a trick question. Oxford University has produced those that have gone to university. Keir Starmer did go to Leeds, he went to Oxford as well as a postgrad. There are some prime ministers who didn't go to university. But yeah, of those that went to use this incredible fact that they all went to this one institution, not even Cambridge could make a claim to this. And hasn't got to produce some very strange people over the last 50 years. I have to say, there have been times when there's certainly one on the name here that I've been in charge, and I have to think I am going to leave this. I'm finally enough of this. I'm leaving. But yeah, it's an important point this, because for educators, what I find is that often for colleagues, I do a lot of talks with people for the FE college sector, and I find that the policy churn and the lack of support for teachers, they get paid less in FE colleges. I think it's partly a product of the fact that people making these decisions do not have any experience of those types of groups, right? Most of the pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds after age 16 will end up in their FE college, but we pay the teachers less. It's a very inequitable system we have. It's partly because the people that govern us are all from a very narrow slice of society. We do have an issue at the top, and I would argue that leads to an increasingly detached link. We will share these slides. There's too much information on here for you to digest all of this. But for the next book, we've been trying to map the social class system. And essentially what we're arguing is there is this detached 1-5% at the top increasingly and the rest. And it's really important as educators because what we're finding is the disadvantage or barriers to learning come in, and you'll all be very much aware of this, it isn't just FSN versus rest, it's everyone actually, up to probably about 1-5% depending on how you define it. And that's very much defined in terms of wealth. It's those people who own significant wealth and have a particular cultural codes which I'll come to. But I'm going to skip this because we could do a whole lecture on that on the slide. But I just want to give you a sense. Class is very much an issue for us in today's society. It's just different to the sort of class that we would talk about when I was younger. It's less defined by jobs. It's more complex. It's about what you own as much as what you earn in many ways. I'm a big fan of Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, and he talks about the strands of class: economic, social, and cultural capital. In the olden days, if I can put it that way, those things lined up in terms of class brackets. But now, what we're finding is they don't necessarily line up that. They're fraying, if you like. So you meet people who have complex sort of class backgrounds, but class still matters. These cultural barriers still matter, and they matter and play out in the classroom. So equity, the book, we came up with sort of some principles, as I said, worried by, concerned by that lack of progress. Most educators, I think, want to help children from all backgrounds, irrespective of their background, right? But you'll all be aware that we still have these very stark divides in outcomes in schools. It's partly how you measure outcomes, by the way. If you want to have a big socioeconomic gap in outcomes, you have a very narrow measure of success. Basically performing like in an exam at the end of the year. That's what I do very well. It's one way of measuring success, and it's one way. Some people in my field will say conspiratorially, it's the one way that allows elites to stay at the top. You have these meritocratic elites who can justify their position with their Oxford degrees. But it's because we define merit so narrowly, right? So narrowly. So equity, that term, I was inspired by some of the greatest equity debates in the US, but I'm really thinking of socioeconomic background, of course, intersects with other characteristics, gender, and I think it's very depressing when you look at these studies, because if you have a working class background that attributes your female and ethnic, I don't like that term, ethnic minority, or what the term wants to use, you actually have triple disadvantage. If these things multiply, they don't cancel each other out, so these things are all interconnected. I'm very interested in social background, social class. This was nepotism again, by the way. My son Jack is an art student, so I got him to do these pictures for the book, no money. So I used my family again. Equity is different to equality. It's a kind of notion of fairness about it. It's about doing more for children who are facing those barriers, executive barriers to learn through no fault of their own. So I got Jack, you've probably seen some things on the internet that kind of speak to this. It's the fences, the barriers symbolically here, and we're doing more for those children. I think we should try to do more for those children. I'm not saying we can all those other children, right? But I do think that my hypothesis on this, having been a dad and being a charming sort of trustee, school governor, coming into helping schools to play guitar for children in primary school, all those things, I think you will probably spend more time with middle class children like my own than you probably realise, actually. It's partly because teaching is a hard thing to do. It is a hard thing to do, and I think we're all stretched in many ways. But my hypothesis would be we probably don't spend as much time with those children we probably most want to help in many ways. And it's interesting, the studies will show that teachers will make the biggest difference to those children that have that untapped potential, to put it that way. But the image that I sort of got Jack to do, my son, was this one, which is trying to think about that deficit point I was saying earlier. So this is trying to work with the children, not wanting to lose what values we bring as teachers, but actually thinking about how we work with people's parents in a much more sort of partnership way. There are really deep power imbalances in the way the system is set up. It's nothing not your fault, but the way the school system works creates power imbalances in the way we do parent-teacher meetings. For those parents who had a negative traumatic experience at school, I can tell you that stays with you for life. And the schools that we have in this country particularly, I go to other schools in other countries, they're not quite as bad as us, if you like, in this way. We've kind of looked at a very corporate, transactional, I would call it, formal sort of sense of, I think it's because we pick up high standards somehow. Honestly, when you go to schools, it feels quite non-relational. There's a term that a lot of people in education are using, a relational approach, so I'll come back to that. It is a balancing act on these things, because what you don't want to lose is that authoritative, you know, sort of command, if you like, as a teacher. But I think there is much more of a meeting sort of halfway that we can consider, particularly with parents. Parents, I often get asked for these sessions when I do workshops, always, Lee, how do we get those parents working with us who don't come to school, who aren't engaging with us? And I think it is a long-term relational approach. I don't think there's any secrets to that. I don't think, by the way, that people doors are finding them. I do think it's about spending time, and we can family home visits, secondary as well as primary. You've got to do it sensitively and think through it. But it's one technique, one approach of developing those deeper relationships and debunking some of the biases and assumptions we're making about those families. So in the book, we define what we mean by deficit thinking. It's a term that lots of educationists have used over the years. It basically comes from that notion that we define people by what they lack, not what they bring. And it ties into my work because what we tend to value in school, in the university system, and in society are the traits that are of a middle class. Now, I'm not having a go, I am middle class, there are many good things about being middle class. But I think the problem is we don't articulate those explicitly, what those traits are, speaking confidently, being able to ask the teacher questions, accents, all this stuff, all these things that combine to make you middle class. I think we could be much clearer and more explicit about what the rules of the game are. At the same time, we should respect some of the strengths and values that come from different class communities and different communities generally. Again, these things are all balancing acts, and I think I get misquoted a lot on these things. On curriculum, I got misquoted on, I dare to say that street art was a valued cultural asset. I did say to these theatre, I couldn't resist things. And the Times wrote a whole editorial about me, about woke professor dumbing down children not going to theatre. I was not saying that. By the way, theatre can be working class or middle class. There's all sorts of assumptions we make about these things. But I do believe that many children coming to our classroom should have a rich sort of introduction to many different cultural assets, riches, many of which would come from their own communities as well. I think the Govian notion of cultural capital is a very narrow, top-down notion. It's really important that people consider and get inspired by the theatre, but there are other things as well. So all these things are balancing acts, and sometimes I get excited and probably say too much, but I think for any educator, these are the balances we all make. It was ever thus, but I think it's got more extreme in these recent years where societal divides have become more extreme and more global. This research, I sort of mentioned it a bit earlier, this was by Annette Leroux, very famous American researcher. She came up with this term, concerted cultivation. It basically was the first study to describe the different approaches middle class families and working class families. She didn't use those terms. Again, you've got to be careful with generalizations here. But essentially, it's 20 years old now, but it's been replicated in the UK and other places more recently. And essentially, what the middle classes tend to do is, what I've done, private tutoring is part of this, but it's much deeper and wider. That is what Leroux called this concerted cultivation. You're teaching your children the rules of the game, how to talk. The classic thing in the old studies was, did your children have dinner with you on an evening? And we think that was because you were engaging in talking while eating. These are real skills, right? They were talking about daily politics or whatever it is. It's teaching that cultural competence that when you go into a classroom, you are able to put your hand up in class or whatever it is. So it's teaching us. The working class families and ambition didn't do as much of that stuff. They had what the Leroux called more natural growth camps, much more free time. Leroux's point is that neither of these things are better or worse. There are strengths actually to both approaches. I'm really worried. I have lots of friends who have children much younger than mine. And honestly, they're just my friends, but they all seem to be doing so much with their children that I worry about what freedom their children have. Right? So there's a real balancing act. A lot of these studies, of course, are pre-mobile, pre-tech, so I think that's adding obviously a much bigger complexity to all this. But as an educator, I think we just need to be aware that if you come from a culture that is more work class, you may not have those traits that we want. And by the way, as teachers, as professors, we are by definition middle class. The thing that we do is that we conflate these learned traits for innate ability. We basically judge those children as having more capability, when actually they're just learned traits. Instead of being clear that they are learned traits and making sure that those other children are aware of them, we tend to just conflate them as innate ability. That's the issue. So those are the kind of principles. I'm conscious of time. Maybe we can. How long have we got, Catherine, by the way? How long have we got?
10 minutes. About 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Right. Okay, that last 10 minutes then, I'm going to go through some of the bets that I've developed with teachers and researchers in this area. Maybe if there are any questions you can come to me afterwards if I want to finish the text. I don't know if you've got something to go to, I don't want to encroach on that. So there's lots of these things that we develop. These are practical things now. All this is kind of really interesting, I hope, for you, interesting discussion. But what does it mean for an educator? And we've developed this scorecard, which essentially is a toolkit for teaching leaders. Lots of schools have signed up to this scorecard. Some basic themes to go through with you. Language I've mentioned a few times already. In the book, we challenge this terminology disadvantaged pupil. You can use it at a national level when you define it clearly, but as a practitioner, I think you just have to be careful, because as soon as you, by the way, when I go to school, it's DS, it's TP. Anyone who from outside education can come and what the hell are they talking about? The problem with all these terms is that you subconsciously are more probably falling into labeling, stereotyping. But there is so much diversity, by the way, in the free school girls' children, particularly as it's got bigger and bigger. I think the idea that they're all one sort of child is a bit of a misleading assumption. Again, I don't think we need to do this, it's just, we do this at the university as well, we have these sort of labels. So in the book, we suggested this term. I've done a bit of work with schools and teachers, and basically, and we'll show these slides after because there's so many little tips in here. What I would say to you is, I'm not the word police, right? I think a really interesting exercise for any trust group of schools, school group of teachers, is to think about what is the mutually respectful language that they use for disadvantage. This is a charity called Think Forward, which is a lovely charity helping teenagers in a number of cities. This is a charity, not a school. I don't agree with all these terms, and by the way, language evolves, it's always a journey. Language, but it was interesting, independently, they'd sort of asked these were 16, 17-year-olds, what they think about language. They didn't want to be called disadvantaged, they didn't want to be called kids. Anything that's an Americanism is not good, usually, I find, these debates. I sometimes fall into these sort of traps. They like the idea on the surface, it tends to be used in America a lot, some of the race equity stuff. Anyway, I'll share these slides with you. There's obviously all sorts of debates about language in additional needs literature and other areas. It's a really interesting debate. My view is that, when you talk about parents, don't talk about parent engagement, talk about parent partnerships, all these things. Don't talk about hard to reach families. We are hard to reach. So language is something that I've done in some schools. Pedagogy, listen, when we did the Sun Trust EF toolkit all those years, I got obsessed with effective feedback in the classroom. Did lots of sessions with teachers on that. It's really hard. It's about really the core of good teaching is the interaction between the pupil and the teacher. The one thing that's come out of the more recent literature on equity is this quite challenging finding that we tend to interact less with children who are unlike us in the classroom. And we judge those children from, again, I think I use the word working class here, it can be defined in terms of the education of their parents or other terms and other definitions, but essentially, our brains are hardwired to make quick judgments. There's a whole literature around biases, and one of the things is it comes out in complex environment. I can't think of anything more complex than a teacher in a classroom. So what some of the work I do is just to be aware of those biases, because there's a lot of discussion about how you do that practically, and a lot of debate about how you do it. But I do think that we need to be aware of some biases. I'm, by the way, always board as well. We also do some more children. I always say this to maths teachers, we have a disproportionate number of some children in lowest sets in secondary school. It can't be the case that children who are just happening to some aren't any less clever than other children. It's because we conflate maturity and capability in the earlier phases of schools, particularly an issue in the early years. I'm going to have to skip a bit of time here, but we'll show you slides. But a bit of work I'm doing at the moment is trying to quantify some of the qualities and strengths that come from adverse backgrounds. And there are many, again, just trying to sort of challenge some of that deficit thinking. On curriculum, I don't know if it's a bit of this, right, but I talk about curriculum a lot, but I also talk about the sea slope question in geography. Has there ever been a sea slope question in geography? I'm not sure. Okay, so cruise ship, okay. So the point here is that it's not about what powerful knowledge, lots of space about what children should know. People talk about powerful knowledge. It's a cultural framing around that knowledge, right? I've had this example, I did some sessions with Matt, which is lovely sessions we did around compound interest, and a lot of the questions were around mortgages and investments and things like this. And it's not that we shouldn't intentionally teach people about mortgages, but we should be aware that in a classroom where children might not experience that issue, that thing, that it would add extra cognitive load. And honestly, when you look at the exam questions, they are littered with some of these middle class biases. I'm not a Marxist. I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about these things, but I do think we should need to be aware of the cultural framing of the curriculum. And then finally, parent partnerships. I get asked about parents a lot. I think there's a really interesting thing happening in schools at the moment. Whenever I do workshops, I feel like some teachers have to be that some parents are almost abrogating all responsibility of parenting, in some ways the teacher is now becoming de facto parent. And then you've got what we would probably call this kind of sharp elbow parent who is so concerned about their children that they are, it's just all about their child, right? And so I think teachers are really in the middle on some of this stuff. So we developed some sort of ideas around how you work with parents to get more of those parents back into the system as well. You'll all be aware of some of the challenges here. So part of this is co-developing. What I would say with all this stuff, that we can share these slides afterwards, is what people would call a relational approach. It's about building trust with those parents. It's so simple in some ways, but you're so busy, I find, that a lot of things that I would be fans of kind of squeezed out of the curriculum. So just basic things like celebrating food. Food's always a great one to get parents coming. Celebrating their children in different ways, not just on academic events, by the way. But unless you do it about academic events, better. So listen, I will show this slide, but there's a lot of stuff I think we could do better in terms of parenting, but at school level and at teacher level. There's a lot of really interesting practice around the country in terms of creating neutral spaces. So this often is Nan's front room in a school. I don't know if you've seen that. By the way, when I do these international talks, outside reference, Nan's front room, what are you talking about? I think we all know what that is. It's just a less formal sort of room. It could be a bit of a halfway house. Sometimes you sit outside of the school, it's literally outside. It's a way of getting those parents in. Hopefully some fan of, I always devise opinion when I get teachers together. I think there are some caveats and challenges. It's not right in every context. And there's some really interesting work I've seen where teachers have become sort of advocate of parents, got to be done very sensitively. I'm going to finish there because I will run out of time, but I don't know if we have time for any questions at the end here. As I said, I'd love to do some more work with you if you're up for it in terms of geography teaching particularly. There are a couple of practical resources that people talk about, the scorecard, groups of schools. We've got hundreds of schools now using that, so I would really love more of you to look at that. We'll share the slides. And we've just created this new sort of executive education model of university, which is really for school leaders. So lots of stuff there. I'm going to finish there. I hope that was interesting to you. I've covered a lot of ground. What I would say to you all is, aspiring to do more. And when you look back at history, this was after the Great Crash, Roosevelt. This is when I really liked American presidents. He was very proud actually. You know, if you look at some of the great things he did, he had this, by the way, idea that there should be a maximum salary. It never got through Congress. Can you imagine that? And that maximum, you can't go more. But you know, the idea of free higher education and housing, accessible housing. I think we could do it, honestly, I think we really could. So I hope to convince you to embrace this equity approach and not be intimidated by these influences that we all face. So thank you very much, and maybe we can answer questions, but thank you.
Well, I hope that you found that as fascinating as I did. Absolutely wonderful to hear someone who is so knowledgeable, and like I say, it just chimes with what I'm seeing in my school life. So I'm incredibly grateful. Thank you ever so much, Lee, for coming to speak to us. And I've just been talking to some of the GA headquarters team, and we would absolutely love to do some work with you in the area of geography. And we do have time for some questions. So have you got any questions? Kit, would you like to start us off?
So you talked about biases, which is really great, and it's so good that we're moving the conversation from equality to equity, because that's long overdue. I want to add a few more biases that come across in my work, and I just want to get your opinion, because for me, you've got three other biases. You've got institutional bias, accountability bias, and authoritative bias. And these are three very, very strong biases. We did make the mention that when we talk about systems and systemic. And we're in, you know, we're deep now into the age of academisation where everything is going the wrong way. You know, those biases are strengthening. So we would love to do these kind of things, think outside the box, change these things. But when things are becoming more strict to those biases, how on earth do we approach this when we're being told, not just at a school level, but now at a trust level, you know, about this is the way it's done, this is the way you should do it?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I wrestle with this a lot, because a lot of my work used to be trying to influence governments, but to be honest, most of my work now is working with teachers on the ground. It's almost like a parallel movement, yes. And I get a lot out of that. I'm not being political here, but I found increasingly frustrating with governments because they all fall into the same traps, in my view, and they create a system, actually, the academic system in many ways, that reinforces some of the things you were talking about. So I did talk to Sir Martin Oliver about the Ofsted framework, and there is stuff, I don't know if you've seen it, but there is something around inclusion in it, but some of my colleagues are saying it still feels a bit tick boxy, so you've got to now do certain things. So I would say, you know, a school, just because it serves, terminology is really difficult here, but a community that has many challenges, it's almost impossible to be outstanding, right, in that context. Now, I'm not, the accusation, I guess, people are right, maybe it's not right there, but people in power would say, Lee, that's an excuse, right? I think teachers, you know, it's not an excuse, it's the context in which teachers work. I don't think we do it for any other profession, you know. So I looked, by the way, this stuff I talk about class, and it's quite depressing. If you look back at the 60s and 70s books, people say the same thing as me 50 years ago. But I think teachers were a bit more radical then. I think there was a bit more of a sort of, we're going to stand up for this. And I think we've all been sort of browbeaten into sort of, you know, it feels a bit like that. So I'm hoping, when I talk about, I get very excited for my stuff, because it feels like a bit of a groundswell. And a lot of people come to me and say, this is what I kind of went into the profession for. So I'm trying to influence governments, but I feel like this is in parallel to, I have to say, that some of the stuff I do in schools is, let's plan all this for children and think about how we value their outcome more generally, and then let's think about how you survive the next Ofsted inspection. You know, it's kind of that tension that I have a lot of my work. So I think it's a fair challenge. I wish I could change the world, but I think it's probably going to be more the working on the ground. A lot of countries, by the way, I find have always similar assumptions. It's because we can measure these things very simply, right? You can measure academic attainment very, very simply, right? And there's a lot of discussion around this. Don't just be dictated by the things you can measure. There are children's outcomes. There's so much to life, as you all know, that other than academic attainment. So I would say this to the professor as well. And yet, the school system is very distorted, I feel, by that very thing. I'm not saying get rid of it, I'm just saying we need to balance it. So I think it's a very good challenge to make. Do you want like?
Lee, oh, sorry, thanks. Really enjoyed your presentation, and really also interested to hear you talk about place a couple of times. And it seems to be you're taking a different view on place to the way place and geography was reflected in the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, Tony Sibyl's work, that almost position places from geography as a neutral thing that just happened to be different. I just wonder if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, all I would say is the evidence I've seen, it's not just UK, it's elsewhere, is that place seems to play an important part. I mean, in the latest book, we're arguing, it's pretty difficult, as you'll know, to know which are the drivers of these causes, you know, what are, because all these actors relate to each other, right? But I'm convinced there is something about where you live that does have a profound impact on your prospects. You'll all be aware, I mean, there aren't jobs in the vicinity, right? I do think that starts to prompt big questions about what are my future life prospects. In the Southwest, as Catherine, I think there are particular issues around connectivity in the Southwest. And just to get to college can cost a lot of money, right? Or it doesn't happen at all. Whereas if you're in London, you have that connectivity. There are different challenges in London, by the way. And so it seems to me obvious that there are these geographical place divides. I would be far more regional based as a country. I would have much more devolution, crop devolution, to empower people in different parts of the country. I talk around the country, I find it's fascinating and beautiful in this country, but it's very different where you go, right? And I think the sort of one fits all thing for Westminster doesn't work in my opinion. So yeah, I think place is really important. We're very happy to send you some stuff on that, some studies that suggest that. I'm doing a session with Tony Sewell soon, actually. So it'd be good to know, because I didn't realise that he's saying that place doesn't really matter. Is that right? Yeah.
It seems to be a more neutral sort of position rather than.
Yeah. You do, by the way, in London, it's a fascinating stuff I did on higher education participation rates. You see London street by street that there can be profound differences, and it does come to the culture of the household. You know, you go deeper and deeper, but you can't see people in the same postcode. You know, same very, very narrow postcode, very different life prospects. Cities are really interesting, by the way. In the book, we look at all the big cities across the world, and they're becoming more and more uneven. So I'm a huge professor of it, but the world is becoming more polarized. So even in most cities, even in Scandinavia, by the way, if there's any place that could have an American tradition, it's the Scandinavian traditions, because they're more equal society, of course, more egalitarian. But even there, Oslo, there's an increasing divide. It's the house price there. I wish I could have done a whole lecture on class. The thing we're finding, class, is that housing wealth thing is really becoming a big factor, and that correlates with place.
Hi. Sorry. I mean, you kind of just alluded to it, but I just wondered in your research, do you ever see any pockets of success or solutions while you're doing your research? Because it's kind of sad, but anything good?
So in that report, Catherine, I can share the latest report we did on the empty scorecard. We've got about 10 case studies of schools that kind of tried different things. One of them looked at language, another one tried home visits. These are sort of trial and error. We're going to try and do something about this, but what a lot of teachers say to me, I love these stuff, but can you just give some practical examples of someone trying to do this the next week, you know? And so we're trying to build up a library of school case studies, basically. So there's some amazing work going on. When I give lectures in Norway, they all say to me, where is the place? Where? Because I challenge them. And I actually say that some of the best equitable practices in England, it is in England, it's just that we live in a very unequal society. So when I go back to Norway, I'm living in practical digital England. It's just that they have a very equal society outside school. So there's lots of good things happening. So very happy to share that. A lot of this for me is about mindset. And the reason we developed that equity leadership module, it's just a sort of my credential as universities are doing now, is because a lot of leaders, heads were saying to me, Lee, I get all this, but how do I take this and convince all my colleagues? Because there will be some skeptical colleagues in the school who say, I'm really busy, this is like how we're doing sports, you know. So I'm trying to develop approaches that can give someone in a leadership position in school, how do you go back and embrace a more equitable approach in your school? I'm hoping that could be a really nice way of, because it can feel a little bit challenging, can't it? But we can do it, honestly. I hope I haven't sort of demoralised you.
We've got the microphone there, so I think we've got right in front and then just slightly back.
Hey, do you see the nature of the problem now about addressing rising inequality or about coping with it? Because that seems to have come out in your talk. There's a lot of kind of coping mechanisms. But for a geography educational community, at a time where we have more young people studying geography than at any time in recent history, because we have a demographic bulge coming through, do we think about directing the tide of history?
Well, it's a good question. I feel like I'm doing a vibe at this. We can talk about something like that. In the book, the latest book I'm doing, Cracking Class Codes, we do get into a lot of debates. I think it's many more we talk about wealth tax, we talk about big things, right? So in this talk, I'm thinking you as educators, and I'm thinking about practical tips you can do. There's a whole other piece of my work, which is challenging governments around inequality itself. I totally get that. Is that kind of, I suppose, I hope I wasn't sort of, we do come up with some sort of radical thinking around, by the way, the New York mayor, has really embraced the idea of wealth tax. It's not just other countries that are doing that, but is that what you mean? Is that sort of thinking a bit more radical about how we address them?
It is, and it's also thinking that we're speaking to young people. We're communicating with people. What message are we giving to them, and what is the empowering message of hope for the future? So I suppose it's knitting together the day-to-day scale in the classroom and the big scale of where society is moving long term.
Yeah. So I think these are really good challenges, and I'm always conscious of, when you're a professor, you get excited by data evidence. The problem is that your bias is to, God, the world's going to end. So I'm always kind of navigating that. Here's the challenge, but here's what we can do about it. Right? So I think you're right, it's challenging on that. What I would say to you is that young people that I do lectures for, so I do lectures for young people, primary school students as well. What I'm finding, certainly in the older teenagers, is that they are thinking more radically, actually, already. I can show them some ideas, but they're always at the top of this. I think they're really thinking about what is life about, faced with uncertain graduate jobs now. I think there's some really, so a lot of them are, again, I'm not political, but a lot of them, for example, it's interesting when I say who we vote for, a lot of them are looking at the Green Party, for example, I find that the interesting, because I think, even though people critique the Green Party, they are talking about things like wealth inequality in a way that mainstream parties aren't. So my view is that, by the way, there's a classic book in my field, one of the classics, The Rise of Meritocracy by Michael Young, written in 1958. He coined that term, meritocracy. He actually predicted, and pretty much everything he's predicted has come true. He predicted that the society in England, in the UK, would unravel in 2034. Right? So we've got a few years yet. But I think that his argument was that if you have successive generations that aren't being given a fair chance, essentially capitalism is driven by that promise that everyone's got a fair chance to live a decent life. And if that starts to erode over successive generations, his view was that at some point people are just going to say, we've had enough of this. So who knows, But I do think young people are thinking much more radically, and I would love to hear more about that. But I'm really conscious. I hope I don't come across as just cloaking it. There are some radical things. I thought it's only an hour. Tomorrow could have been the wealth and equality session, but. Anyway, yeah, good challenge.
We can talk with Denise with them.
This isn't really a question actually, so it's kind of maybe a fitting end. You talked a little bit, Catherine, about how we might have a little bit more thoughts of this in the geography community. I was really interested in what you said about culture, and it's really making me think. At the moment, we're organising our annual field trip. And we're coming increasingly against real problems in terms of parental support, engagement, and things like that, word engagement partnership, supporting the trip, students not wanting to go, and I think there's a lot of perhaps culture there that I'm not really thinking about. They're hanging away from home before, they don't want to go away from home, whereas middle class students to sign up straight away, they pay, they've got the capabilities to pay. Fieldwork's one of our unique selling points, and so it'd be really good to maybe do some work around that, and I know that people are working on that, because one of our biggest things about our disciplines are the other threat, due to kind of parents haven't got as much money anymore, haven't got as much disposable income, but also we're perhaps excluding people who culturally don't value it as well.
So I'd love to develop an equitable approach to school trips. So many teachers have brought this up. I think the challenge is getting bigger now. I'd say there's a teacher somewhere who's done it well. Well, that's what I find all these things. Some teachers, teachers are amazing. I think it's hearing from quite academic, but they're quite pragmatic and practical. You meet these brilliant teachers that say, "Oh, we just do this one." I'm like, wow. So I'd love to be able to develop maybe and challenge ourselves about the assumptions about school trips. I think there probably are some cultural assumptions in there. We probably could do things better. But I'd love to develop a little case program to share with other teachers. It's not just geography, but I think I can see geography could be a particular issue around that. And by the way, the other thing we won't get into in school governance, I know there's lots of trust now, so lots of school governors are being sort of most, it's all about the trustees now, but I've had some sessions with how to change the makeup of school governance. The problem is we fall into deficit again, because I tell you, there's all meetings in the world. I've been in school government for 40 years nearly. We don't think about how do we change those meetings without throwing everything out, right? But I've been involved in so many schools over the years where we try to get our community to be part of that. They come, it's intimidating, no one changes anything, and it's just, it's demoralising actually. So again, for me that would be deficit. That would be us not changing what we're doing, it's just saying you've got to come to our system, whereas I feel like we've got to somehow be halfway. With the trips, I guess I would suspect, I don't know, but I suspect there's probably some assumptions that we make. We all do it. Universities, by the way, are even worse. So, but yeah, I'd love to do that. Something practical.
Well, thank you ever so much for answering questions, and I really look forward to seeing how maybe a partnership could develop where we could use these ideas in the world of geography. I'm also going to do a little quick sales pitch because I will be doing my presidential lecture tomorrow, and I'm going to be building on a lot of these ideas and stealing some of his slides and applying them in my context of the school that I teach in. So I'm really, really grateful to Lee for what he has presented for us today. So thank you very much. Just a very quick piece of housekeeping, just to let you know that the food, the buffet and the quiz are not taking place in the college. The college is